His idea that everybody should be close to nature, should be in contact with the wonders of nature, equal poor and rich, educated and non-educated. That was his idea, and therefore he initiated many projects to realize this.
There's a Krumbiegel road that skirts around the Lalbagh, but nobody recognizes Krumbiegel. The common public did not know much about Krumbiegel. They thought it was somebody who was an Indian with a very strange name.
The German Consulate General was newly established in Bangalore. Our task is to establish and to strengthen bonds between Germany and India. Therefore, when Indian people came to see me, they talked about Krumbiegel, various aspects of his life, and this made me curious.
The whole story started with a phone call from India. On the phone was Mr. Löffler from the German consulate of Bangalore, and he was telling us some story about a German gardener from Pillnitz who left to India in the 19th century and who made a huge career with the Maharaja. Well, I was working for the state palaces gardens of Saxony at that time, and we had never heard before of this Gustav Hermann Krumbiegel.
It took the Germans by surprise. It was a pleasant surprise.
Now, Krumbiegel started with his interests in botany and landscape design and all related subjects very early in life. He was born in Lohmann, close to Dresden, in the countryside where the beautiful river Elbe flows.
It is one of the few places which have a serious and really vast experience in garden culture and landscape architecture. In the early to mid-19th century, we had something like a land embellishment movement, which gave a first stimulus to landscape architects. One of these outcomes was that we would establish a school where we would train landscape architects. There, for the first time ever, garden artists were trained in a 4-year program.
So imagine the whole setting. Gustav Hermann was born in Lohmann. He was the eldest of many siblings, and it was a rather poor family. Whereas the city of Dresden was well known for its gardeners, for its flourishing nurseries. And I think that was one point when Gustav Hermann thought maybe this could be a chance to become a gardener and to start a new life.
Born as the son of a restaurant owner near Dresden, he could have become restaurant owner. But he left school at the age of 14 and started his education, practical and theoretical education in Pillnitz Royal Gardens.
He started his professional training under Dr. Wentz, very close to Dresden, where he studied landscape design and landscape architecture.
Gustav Hermann Krumbiegel started his career as an apprenticeship at the Royal Gardens in Pillnitz in Dresden, age 14 in 1879. And then he went to the Royal Gardens at Mecklenburg and Hamburg, and he was ambitious enough to want to come to Kew Gardens.
Initially, he worked in the flower beds in Hyde Park while brushing up on his English. And soon after that, within a year, he found himself in Kew Gardens.
But he had to apply 3 times, and then he was accepted. And from there on, a whole new world opened up for him.
133 years ago, in those days, Kew was countryside for all intents and purposes, and the staff had to search for lodgings when they arrived. Working hours were 6 till 6, 6 days a week, and 1 Sunday each month.
He was so well received and he learned so much. He was so eager to learn more that he stayed several years, and he even fell in love with a British girl whom he married.
I think in these early years, you can see his character. It was this kind of flexibility to adapt to new people, to new places. Also a thirst of knowledge to develop yourself, to learn about things, and still to be some kind of ground to earth, not to forget your roots, just like a plant, to know where you come from. And these are the main character things which brought him out to the world and made him successful, I think.
In the UK, he was allowed to follow lectures and to complete his education.
He spent 5 years in Kew Gardens, leaving Kew Gardens with his final training in the plant propagation department.
His supervisor in charge of the herbaceous department of the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, was William Golding himself, only 23 years old, and who, it appears, also spent half of 4 years from 1888 in charge of landscaping the 288-hectare grounds of the Lakshmi Palace for the Maharaja Sayajirao Gaekwad III of Baroda.
And just as he was thinking of working somewhere in the tropical regions, a letter came from the Gaekwad of Baroda to Kew Gardens saying that they want a curator for the Gaekwad's dominions, as it were.
So in 1893, shortly before the formation of the Kew Guild, the Maharaja Sayajirao Gaekwad III visited Kew Gardens to seek a replacement for William Golding to continue the landscaping of his palace gardens in Baroda.
Queen Victoria had invited the royal families of India to come and see the splendor of the British Empire. When a royal family goes on a visit to a foreign country, at that time they are supposed to discharge lot many functions, and lot many events are to be addressed. My great-grandfather, my great-grand-uncles, they visited practically almost all the castles, the chateaux and the palaces in England and Europe. And then they zeroed down upon Kew Gardens because they found that the products, the chief gardeners, the gardeners and the interns of the institution called Kew Gardens happened to be ultimate. So they interviewed about 7 or 8 people in Kew Gardens itself.
Krumbiegel was apparently so interested and so able to do things that Kew Gardens recommended him to the Maharaja of Baroda as a superintendent of state gardens.
Maharaja Sayajirao was known to meet over tea. You see, in England, the tea time between 4 and 5, that is the official tea time. So he used to invite such people for tea. And that is how the first interaction with G.H. Krumbiegel, Gustav Hermann Krumbiegel, who was known as the German Sahib here later on, that happened over a tea party. And that is how finally he was shortlisted, and around 1891-92 he was given the final employment order.
When Krumbiegel had the chance to go from London to India, especially to Baroda there, this was unheard of. It was like a ticket into paradise.
Can you imagine at the age of 28, a young German married to a British girl, to go on a boat to India to serve Indian Maharajas. For a German, at that time, it was quite an extraordinary career already at this stage.
I don't know what he knew about Baroda as long as he was in Kew Gardens, but it is an unusual opportunity to come to a country which was barely known in Germany.
And he was well kitted out for going to India to replace Goldring. And it was into the unknown. He was going to sail on a ship, who knows, Southampton, Port of London, and off to India for however long it took for the rest of his life.
My great-grand-uncle Maharaja Sayajirao was adopted in the year 1875. The moment he took over power here, he found that from 1875 till 1880, that there was a lot of need of greenery and there was a lot of need of gainful employment. Now, what is gainful employment? Because in those days, agriculture was dependent only on one monsoon. Therefore, he started thinking of developing nurseries in the beginning, which would be the feeder by supplying plant saplings and all this for gardens, and gardens came in much later. By 1878-79, the philosophy and the concept of developing hundreds of gardens across the expanse of Baroda state had become a reality.
So when he came to Baroda, he came to an area in India which was known as the Garden of India. So the Indians themselves considered this area around Baroda as the Garden of India.
I'll give you an idea and perspective of what the kingdom of Baroda state was. Today we are here in a city called Baroda. This is the capital of the kingdom. Our territory starts from Dwarka. Dwarka is 800 kilometers from here, 500 miles in the northwest. And our territory goes up till southeast, which is in Songad, 400 kilometers from here. And from Patan to Sanjan, such a huge expanse of territory the Gaekwads, the Marathas used to control. We were the overlords, we were the Gurjar Naresh.
Sir William Goldring was the curator before him. Now, Sir William Goldring was a formidable man. He had designed over 750 gardens, mainly in England, but all the great gardens in England were designed by him. And the 750 acres around Lakshmi Vilas Palace, which was then the biggest residence in the world, 4 times the size of Buckingham Palace. So Krumbiegel, he was unfazed. At a very young age, he took Goldring's place and he went on to spend 14 years in Baroda. What I need to stress here is, at a very, very young age, he was dealing with the greatest botanists in the world. And there hasn't been a single comment talking about Krumbiegel not really being as professional as any of them.
He is the person who started the tree census. So we used to have a plan of the garden which gave you the tree census of each tree which is in the garden, because millions and millions of trees have been planted by Krumbiegel. Those trees are still alive. Second thing is that he suggested the Maharaja that link plantation of trees to population. This nobody had suggested. We had a thumb rule of planting 10 trees when a girl was born and 15 trees when a boy is born in the Baroda state. But he formalized this by way of a law. That is the reason the green cover of Baroda state especially was one of the highest in the country in those times. I'm talking of the princely Raj. Third important thing is that he set up plantation nurseries. Baroda state in those days, I'm talking of 125 years ago, boasted of more than 600 nurseries, small and big. So the German Sahib with the typical pith helmet hat, he used to roam around in the town or the village or the city on horseback. And he has designed gardens for 64 palaces. The Gaekwad Sarkar has built more than 7,000 buildings. Out of that, some 64 palatial buildings, which are edifices, all had gardens. Each piece of architecture and the type of garden, it gels seamlessly. That is because of Krumbiegel. The economy of the kingdom of Baroda state was an agrarian economy, and there was only one source of water, and that was the monsoon rains. So Krumbiegel hit a very bright idea that in all the 3,300 villages of Baroda state, plus around 4,000, 5,000 villages more, which we used to control, something like 8,573 villages. He said that let us work upon a formula by which we harness the potential of a good monsoon in a ditch. And when the monsoon comes, Krumbiegel had a thumb rule that the ditch would fill in half the monsoon season time. Therefore, they started excavating those ditches which were already inherently around in the villages, and they started constructing agricultural ponds, which in Gujarati are known as khet talaudis, or they are known as farm ponds. He said that it has manifested itself in lot of benefits. The first benefit is perennial water supply to you. Second thing is that the water table, the groundwater level and the groundwater table, it rises. Third thing is that he started putting fish seedlings into the water, and a thriving business of fresh water fishery developed in Baroda state, which became an export-oriented unit in later years. This formula of Krumbiegel, which was conceived about 125 to 130 years ago, is being followed even by the new regime post-1950. And it is remarkable that we are the beneficiaries of that particular concept.
125 साल पहले क्रुम्बीगल बड़ौदा में आए थे और उन्होंने घर घर में और सारी जनरेशन में जो फैलाया था उन्होंने कि प्लांट्स लगाने चाहिए, वो इतनी पीढ़ी से चलता आया है। उसे आज मेरे साथ भी यही हुआ है कि उनसे मैं 125 साल पहले की ये जो बात है, अभी भी मैं उनसे इतना इंस्पायर हूँ, इतनी प्रभावित हूँ कि ये जो मेरे घर में आप इतने सारे प्लांट्स देख रहे हैं, ये उनकी वजह से है। तो ये जो मेरा है, वो मैं मेरी आगे की जनरेशन में पास ऑन करना चाहती हूँ।
In these 14 years, the Gaekwad of Baroda, apart from getting Krumbiegel to work on various things in Baroda state, as it were, including Makarpura Palace and various other places, he permitted him to work for the other princes in India. So he started this long interaction and journey with all the princes in North India initially, that it started with Alwar and Cooch Behar. And then it went on to Jodhpur, Jaipur, and right through up to Hyderabad, and then even later to Sivaganga and Trivandrum. Basically, Krumbiegel all his life worked for the princes in India.
This was must have been an extraordinary experience for Krumbiegel in Baroda. From there, he went even further south into Bangalore and Mysore.
Mysuru, actually, it was a royal capital during erstwhile Mysuru Maharaja's period. It is actually a city of palaces. More than the gardens, more palaces are there.
And Mysore in those days was basically the richest state in the world. It was under English rule, but it had no tough English rule. They had the same army, but otherwise they could work on their own.
At the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of 20th century, there was a lot of enthusiasm about urban landscaping, development of parks and gardens, and planting of avenue trees in the then princely state of the Mysuru.
You know, one must also know that those days the horticulture was Bangalore-Mysore centric. It was in the British colonial days, and one had to do what Maharaja, the colonial masters and the Diwans said.
To speak about Mysore state without mentioning the name of Nalvadi Krishnaraj Vadayar, we cannot start the horticulture history.
Nalvadi Krishnaraj Vadayar was those days one of the most important Maharajas of the 650 smaller states.
Maharaja Krishnaraj Vadayar, who had succeeded his father and also had become For a brief period between 1897 to 1902, his mother was the regent. So by 1902, he was already full in control as the ruling monarch. The relationship between the Baroda and the Mysuru goes back to Chamaraj Wadiyar's period, and it continued during his son's period. And by that time, Farnil Palace was also doing well as a summer residence of the Mysuru Maharajas, and I understand the Baroda Maharaja also had developed the garden there.
The Royal Ooty estate of the Gaekwad Sarkar is just having a common boundary wall with the Fernhill estate of the Maharaja of Mysore. Because Chamarajendra Wadiyar X, the Maharaja of Mysore, was just like Anna to Maharaja Sayajirao. Anna means an elder brother. We had 400 acres of lush green forests in that estate once upon a time.
His Highness Nalvadi Krishnaraja Wadiyar had come to know of the capabilities and about the talents of Krumbiegel. So he requested the Baroda Maharaja to send him across to the princely state of Mysore.
So that is how Krumbiegel came to Mysore state, but incidentally Maharaja gave him all powers, privileges and also his salary, everything he took care.
And then after that, right from 1908 to 1956 when he died, it was all out of Mysore state, and he was based in Bengaluru.
So I think this is a very, very unusual career, and a career which cannot be appreciated too much.
I went for a research tour to Mysore and Bangalore, and I found a lot of interested people there who had already done some research about him. And we found out that actually there should be some Krumbiegel family around the London area. So I made contact with the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew, and from there on, Mr. Richard Ward took over.
It was in 2015 that the Kew Guild had a message on email from the Pillnitz Gardens asking if we had any information about Gustav Hermann Krumbiegel. I obviously, since he was at Kew Gardens 140 years ago, I had no idea. So in the end, I decided I'd put an advert in the local paper in Fulham, because apparently his family had a house there. So that's what we did, and I eventually heard from Hermann's great-granddaughter, Alia, which was amazing.
Okay, so this is your great-great-great-grandfather, and your great-great-grandfather, and my great-grandfather.
It was actually a Tuesday evening, completely changed my life from that moment. I saw the advert on the iPad. Then I sort of scrolled up and I thought, that's great-grandfather, and that's my grandmother, and that's my mother. And I was thinking, and I wasn't quite sure. I was thinking, this is very odd. Then I sort of read Seeking, and that night I really didn't sleep. I think I got into work the next morning at probably about 7:30, because I needed to phone. And then I rang this number, and Richard was out. So I spoke to his wife, who was very like, oh. And then from there, it just snowballed. But absolutely, I do remember that moment. That was the moment that completely changed my way of thinking, everything. It was probably meant to happen.
unbelievable. What a surprise. I mean, after all the history stuff, we had finally found the living connection to Gustav Hermann Krumbiegel. And it was even more special for me when I had the chance to meet her during the exhibition in Pillnitz. And we handed her over a garland, a flower garland, on behalf of Gustav Hermann. It was very emotional to see her walking on the grounds where her great-granddad had walked and planted and started his career about 130 years ago.
Actually, Krumbiegel was superintendent of government gardens. He took care of gardens in Bengaluru, in Mysuru, and also in Ooty. The history of Lalbagh goes back to 200 years. It was started in 1760. Even now, few trees planted by Tipu are still there. And after exit of Tipu and Hyder, the garden was taken over by the East India Company.
The Britishers took a lot of interest to revive Lalbagh and make it into a garden what it is today. But end of the day, after 1881, when the Mysuru rendition took place, when the Maharaja Sayajirao Gaekwad III became the reigning king of the Mysuru, the garden came back to the control of the Mysuru administration again.
Because Lalbagh had been worked on for 50 years before that by people who had come in from Kew, Krumbiegel's name is generally forgotten in terms of the structures he made there, because Cameron made the glass house, the dovecote.
One of the first jobs which Krumbiegel did was in 1908 was to shift the statue of Sayajirao Gaekwad III from Mysuru to Lalbagh. There's a beautiful Maharaja Square, what it is called, which was developed by Krumbiegel.
Now you mustn't forget, at this time it was the Maharaja of Mysuru who was in control, and he obviously must have approved of it. And I think it was a subconscious kind of move of Krumbiegel to almost indicate that the center of power is moving from Mysuru to Bengaluru.
Nalvadi Krishnaraj Gaekwad, being a very progressive Maharaja, had great foresight and had recognized the talents of G.H. Krumbiegel.
It's known that the Maharaja of Mysuru never ever shook hands with any of his officials except Krumbiegel, who had the privilege of shaking hands with the Maharaja of Mysuru.
And meanwhile, Bengaluru Palace has come up with a new building, so a beautiful garden was to be laid out there. So Krumbiegel services were requisitioned. It was actually a personal affair of Maharaja, but he gave the job to Krumbiegel only.
Krumbiegel had a very good equation with the Mysore royalty, especially with Krishnarajendra Odiyar, the fourth. And I think with this, there came in a lot of changes.
He had a total commitment to his work and to every improvement he could make, right through Mysore state. It was not just Bangalore, but even in Mysore city. And this found itself being addressed by Krumbiegel in things like he felt that there weren't enough fruiting trees in Bangalore and in Mysore.
Krumbiegel, after he took over charge as a garden superintendent of Lalbagh, his main focus was on plant introduction. So he started introducing plants from exotic and also from the native source. And actually he brought many plants from Australian origin and also from the European origin. And later on he came to know that the Australian origin plants were more adaptable than the European origin. By keeping that in view, actually he introduced 100 plus varieties of apple, apricot, several varieties of almond, and also the fig varieties to Lalbagh, and actually he studied in detail.
And he listed these fruits out and gave a 2-line description of each fruit for the farmers of the state. Then 6 months before he brought these saplings in from Australia, he sent out a notice to farmers saying that they can buy these saplings from him he would have it imported from Australia. They just had to mention the numbers they wanted, and the prices were like 1 rupee 4 annas, and that is even though it seems very incredibly low today, even in those days it was quite low. And he brought these saplings in and packed it in Lalbagh, sent it by rail to the farmers.
But those plants which were coming from abroad, they were to be quarantined. The very term quarantine was first time was used by Krumbiegel here in the Mysuru state. And for that purpose, he started a fumigatorium. And whatever the plants he used to get from abroad, he used to sanitize them in that fumigatorium. Now it is a common buzzword, fumigatorium. But it is Krumbiegel. The credit goes to Krumbiegel.
But he was an extraordinary man, because to him, I've read a note where he says that India, more than any other country he knows of, the fruits and vegetables are infested with pests. And therefore, the botanical drawings should also include drawings of the pests which infest these plants.
Because the pest and disease is the most important menace to cultivate fruits and vegetables. By keeping that in view, during Krumbiegel's period, many paintings was done on fruits and vegetables along with pests and diseases.
I mean, he did a lot of extraordinary things. He's the first person who took entomology into his daily work, because the pests affecting the plants. Nobody else did anything like that, And the tragedy is that none of them were followed up on. I mean, not none, but most of it.
Great-grandfather was a planner. Everything he touched, he improved upon. Even if the structure was there, he made it better. He designed his way from Dresden to Bangalore, and everything he touched, he made beautiful.
He was instrumental in 1910 and 11 to establish the Mysore Dasara exhibitions, where a lot of modernized equipment and policies about horticulture and agriculture were kind of made public, which gave the farmers and the local people a new impetus to become modern. This is a very important contribution that Krumbiegel does to the modern state of Mysore. With him, we also have to realize that there is a whole group of people who were important, especially the Diwans of Mysore, Sir M. Visheshwaraya, Mirza Ismail, who were very close associates of Mr. Krumbiegel, and gave him a kind of a free hand to develop and give Mysore a modern identity.
He has given a lot of emphasis for the bioaesthetic. So keeping that in view, he started Mysuru Horticultural Society during 1912 to encourage the ornamental horticulturist in the city area.
He knew the value of the training. So in 1913, when Krumbiegel was here in Lalbagh, Maharaja started a Mysore Economic Conference. It was something like a Planning Commission of India now. In that economic conference, he raised the point of training of gardening to all the gardeners here. So, economic conference sanctioned horticulture school for Lalbagh.
G.H. Krumbiegel, who served the princely state as the superintendent of government gardens and later the director of horticulture, had a lot of love for plants and also flowers, and the later the botanist and horticulturist termed him as a flower maniac.
Something significant about Krumbiegel is the serial blossoming. It's curating of nature. In Bangalore, annually there is a perpetual spring. There's not a season without flowers.
For the first time, G.H. Krumbiegel did that experiment in Bengaluru and Mysuru. He introduced different flowering trees such as jacaranda, then bahunias, then also spathodiyas, peltoforums, and so many other plants introduced. And he planted in such a way that every month and during every season, there used to be flowers in one or the other trees in that avenue.
Basically, it was called as Ritu Samhara, or the kind of poetic way of representing nature. which also meant curating the different kinds of plant species from all over the world, from the tropics, and bringing them to Bangalore and kind of planting them in such a way that Bangalore would have perpetual spring. This created a certain aesthetic for the city as a garden city. I think this is one of the important contributions of Krumbiegel in terms of choosing this different kind of palette for the trees. So there is a certain kind of German romantic idea when he is choosing these trees and planting them in clusters to be visible in the urban landscape of Bangalore.
Actually, he started conducting the flower shows in a very systematic way in glass houses. Then later on, actually, the flower show era was continued, and now actually we have completed around 209 flower show. And if you take the global scenario, after United States and London Chelsea show, the Lalbagh flower show finds third place globally. So definitely that credit goes to Krumbiegel. Cubbon Park actually was just a general park, and it was it was a replica of Hyde Park of London. Almost most of the garden components were similar to Hyde Park. There was a beautiful garden and that lengthy road leading to Hudson Circle. So that was the main work actually done by Krumbiegel, and also the statue of Victoria Rani and Edward Raja and other statues came up during Krumbiegel's period. Similarly, actually he worked on IISc, Indian Institute of Science campus, the architectural aspects of the building, and also focused on the garden, this thing.
When he came into Bangalore, there were just basically 4 gardens. There was Cubbon Park, there was Lalbagh, the National Dairy Development Corporation on Adugodi has a large acreage. He worked on that, and one other garden. Till in 1932, when his official tenure ended, there were over 100 gardens in Bangalore. That was the beginning of Bangalore being called the Garden City.
He has done so much, and every place I stand at gives me a different feeling. You can see by the fountains in Cubbon Park and Lalbagh, everything is you can see it's him, but you just know it's different. He designed differently and landscaped differently for different spaces. An amazing man.
Then suddenly, during both the world wars, he was interned. He was a German and he was in British India, despite Mysore employing him. Now, when he was interned, he earned no salary. So he actually became quite poor in those 2 periods.
The 4 years of internment for the Krumbiegel whole family was very, very hard. In fact, it was probably quite shocking.
On November 29th, 1919, Mrs. Krumbiegel gets a note from Mr. Tasker, who's the district magistrate, lets Mrs. Krumbiegel know that Mr. Krumbiegel is going to be repatriated to Germany very early in December, so that gives them a few days only, in a ship called the Maine, and that she has to let Mr. Tasker know whether she and her children would like to join Mr. Krumbiegel on the Maine to Germany. This shook up the whole family. And a copy of that cable was sent to Krumbiegel. And he writes to Sir Mirza Ismail, who was then the Huzur secretary to the Maharaja of Mysuru, saying, I almost went out of my mind when I got this notice. I have no home in Germany, and I'm trained for tropical architecture. I will get no work. Added to that, I defended the British. While he was in Ahmednagar in the jail, there were 8,000 other Germans in that jail, all of whom were, of course, pro-German. And Krumbiegel was considered an enemy alien, being a German. And he was interned there, and when some newspaper articles came talking about Germans being at large, so on and so forth, and he defended the government of Mysuru, and he got very badly assaulted for that, is the phrase he uses. And he says, despite all this, to be asked in a few days to go to Germany, my whole world collapsed around me, and all my property, including whatever shares, which were actually kept as a collateral for the debts he took during the internship period to keep his family going, they would all be seized by the British government, and they would be set aside against the German debt in the First World War. Now, for the Maharaja, it was a very difficult decision, because all his privileges and his being the Maharaja of Mysuru was really because of the British. He couldn't afford to fight them. Now, the Maharaja of Mysuru and the British finally reached a conclusion that more than 3 Germans who were already established in the state, no more Germans would be allowed to professionally be involved in Mysore state. The reason was very clear to the British, that as if there isn't a British architect or botanist who can work in Mysore state, why do you have to have enemy aliens, the Germans, working? So this compromise was between the Maharaja of Mysore and the British. The compromise was that Krumbiegel, then you have Koningsberger, and then after that you have Exner, who was also an architect and an interior decorator. These 3 people did their work in Mysore, but in the buildings, in the foundation stone, their names will not be mentioned, so that for posterity the German presence will not be known. And you will find that in Koningsberger's building in Kavan Park, which is the Bal Bhavan today, there's no mention of Koningsberger at all. Krumbiegel designed the BBMP building, among other things, in Bangalore, and I think the foundation stone doesn't have his name there either.
He had a very hard time. He never really spoke about that time. He was hurt very badly, but he only ever spoke about it once. He said that it had happened, and then he moved on, and he never ever spoke about it after that.
Krumbiegel, other than being a very good urban planner, an architect, and being a very good horticulturist, I think he was a very good human being. He was able to connect with his contemporaries, with his subordinates, and make them realize and work through his ideas. So this is something that we really realize, that he was a very kind-hearted gentleman.
He became a man Friday, or whatever we want to say, a much trusted man by the Maharaja, and also one could see that during this entire period, much part of this period, he developed a good rapport with Diwan Mirza, who was at that time only a secretary of the Maharaja. But it is only later on, when Mirza became the Diwan, the work in 1927 for the Brindavan Gardens started. Probably the lifetime achievement of Krumbiegel, I would say.
It is actually envisioned by Yuvaraja when he was in France, based on the Lido garden. After he came back, he spoke to his brother Lalbagh as well as Krumbiegel to design the gardens based on the Lido garden of Europe, as well as our Indian garden of Mughal garden, Shalimar garden of Srinagar.
Now this is a very creative work, because he was trained in European garden design, and suddenly to move over to an Islamic garden with their usual, fairly stringent conditions under which the garden has to be designed. So you don't have curves, for example, in an Islamic garden. A straight line in a garden is symbolic of the rigid moral path you followed in the world.
Let us say if you talk about Lalbagh, whether you talk about Bangalore Palace, other things, they were an ongoing project. That means the previous horticulturists, the superintendents also contributed some part to the development of those places. Whereas when you talk about the Brindavan Garden, it is totally new, a greenfield project, nothing was there, and it is a one of its kind even today. Probably when you look at it as a garden by itself, it's sheer imagination, everything was done anew. There is nothing on record to go what it should be.
I think the best story of all is when great-grandfather took mother, who was his oldest granddaughter, to the Brindavan Gardens in Mysuru, and somehow he arranged, and I don't know how, he signalled, and the lights came on with the waterfall when you're standing on the hill, and she told me she was like 5, and she said she still just remembers that, and then it's not till later that you sort of know that he designed and planned those gardens.
Kavadiyar Palace gardens were laid out on the basis of the Brindavan Gardens in Mysuru, in terraces with a water body in the middle with fountains.
Growing up in Thiruvananthapuram, I haven't come across Krumbiegel's name or even a picture of this man here. But when I was doing a research on Thiruvananthapuram and its heritage structures, I happened to chance upon some old documents. And I also saw some files in the archives from the PWD department. And I saw this name written on the files, Krumbiegel. The last Maharaja of Travancore, Sri Chitrathirunal Balarama Varma, before he was given full powers, he went to Bangalore for administrative training. This was around 1930.
Chitrathirunal Balarama Varma was my uncle, and he was a very young man when he was in Bangalore for a year, going to administrative college, because you had to learn how to be a good ruler. You couldn't just walk in. And that is the time he came in contact with Krumbiegel. And Krumbiegel was brought to Trivandrum to lay out the palace gardens and also the Kavadiyar Avenue. Now, where in Vellambalam, what they call Vellambalam Square, I remember it was all done with the flower pots. They had arranged flower pots graded like a pyramid, and that was the traffic island. And of course, the pots were changed according to the season, so it was always there was always color.
What we see today, the Grand Avenue roads that has become a landmark feature of Thiruvananthapuram, has been designed by him. And some of the well-known city squares, like the Kavadiyar Square, was designed by him. And the proposals to convert Putharikandam into an urban open space was initially given by Krumbiegel. And he also gave a proposal to develop a marina, that is a seaside road connecting Shangamukham beach with Kovalam. So he was a pioneer in this field, and his contributions as a town planner has given Thiruvananthapuram a new face.
Krumbiegel got retired in the year 1932 from the post of Director of Horticulture. He was the last European director of horticulture. But he continued in this service till his death. There was a great demand for Krumbiegel after retirement. But for all the purpose, he gave Lalbagh as his home address.
He worked as a landscape architect and horticulturist. In addition to that, his major focus was on as a town planner. He was the first chief architect of Karnataka during his tenure, and even after retirement, actually, he has become the member of CITB, City Improvement Trust Board.
Now it is called BDA. In that capacity, he gave the idea of green zone around Bengaluru. That green zone serves as a buffer between the city and the rural area. So even now the Bengaluru Development Authority following that green belt concept.
During that time, he was focused on actually developing several new buildings like BBMP stone building and also the Mythic Society building and then Janta Bazaar complex and several other buildings were actually laid by Krumbiegel. That was this brainchild.
Mysore Palace is considered one of the best palaces in India. Particularly when people say it's the best palace, it is the front portion which they are talking about. Because many people still attribute the Mysore Palace design to one Mr. Henry Irwin. But I feel it is a wrong concept because what was completed in 1910 is totally different from what you visualize today. Today when you look at it, you see the Mysore Palace, only the Mysore Palace is there, nothing else is there. But in those days, the very town of the city of the Mysore was the rich and the powerful people all stayed in multiple mansions inside. All had been demolished, the garden was created, the whole aura has been created afterwards. Today what you see, I visualize as the beauty of the Mysore Palace. There is a large contribution by the committee of which Krumbiegel was part of it. And when you see the records, you see that he has contributed immensely in designing this palace itself. All this has not come to light because not many people seem to have put their mind into studying the archival material. And still there is so much to be studied.
Krumbiegel was so privileged, no other civil servant had a statue commissioned by a Maharaja. It was Krumbiegel's statue, it is still there in the Mysore Palace, and also a painting, Krumbiegel's portrait painting is there in the Mysore.
The Maharaja had a great respect for Krumbiegel. As soon as he came out from his bedroom, goddess Chamundeshwari idol on one side and portrait of Krumbiegel on another side. So that was the symbol of the relationship between Maharaja and Krumbiegel.
This is important to say that Krumbiegel was seen in great esteem by the Maharajas and the court, and they wanted to acknowledge his debt by making a public sculpture for him.
Probably it was got it done by the Maharaja with a view to put it in some garden. Why it did not materialize, I have no idea. Probably because of the change in the circumstances, it could not be implemented.
Then he got on to doing some work for the Tatars with Dr. Nirodi, which went on to the Jubilee Park, which is very, very famous in Jamshedpur.
Dr. Nirodi actually was not a horticulturist, but he became horticulturist with the influence of Krumbiegel. Nirodi and Krumbiegel, at the request of Tatars, they traveled to Jamshedpur. They designed a beautiful garden for the celebration of Diamond Jubilee in Jamshedpur, and Nirodi has recorded in his book about Krumbiegel's contribution.
Actually, his work was valued by all the princes in India whom he worked for based on his professional ability. And that never stopped after independence.
And the flag of India, our flag, the tricolour, is unfurled.
It was not just Mysore state. He was appointed director of agriculture, I think, after independence. He was also appointed chief architect to the Mysore government.
Krumbiegel was chosen to do the landscaping of the Rajghat. So this is a very important, assignment for Krumbiegel in the capital. Krumbiegel, as you know, that Krumbiegel worked in many places in India, and this was, I think, one of his last assignments.
One aspect which I found also touching was the fact that the Indians who knew about Krumbiegel felt very sorry how he had been treated at the end of his career, during the revolution.
The end was very tragic. They ran out of money. They didn't have the status. They had to depend on the Maharaja even for a place to live in. But in 1950, when the Maharaja of Mysuru discovered that he didn't have a place to stay in, he gave him a rent-free house at a place which was called Granite Castle, next to Jaimal Palace.
He was more seen as somebody who belonged to the royal family, who served the royal family and who served the interests of the royal family.
When Krumbiegel died in 1956, the state government gave Mrs. Krumbiegel a very short eviction notice. She had to leave the place in a few days.
Because it was a rent-free accommodation given by the government of Mysuru. And as you can see that, post-1950 Maharaja, it had become part of the democratic government. So as you probably the then chief minister or the ministers in charge were not ready to continue to give it as a rent-free accommodation post, which happens even today. Any official dies in or he retires, they have to vacate the place.
Without knowing the background of how much had been contributed by Krumbiegel and Mrs. Krumbiegel. And she, at the age of 90, she left India then. All her papers were given to a gentleman called Mr. Cruz, I think, which should be somewhere in Lalbagh. And she went to England, suffered a stroke, and then died. So it was a sad end, to his story in India. Otherwise it was all very, very grand.
The Indian friends, they always said it was not just, and so we want to kind of compensate that fact.
There are very few people who are still alive who know Krumbiegel. And this is interesting to kind of look back at him with a lot of appreciation, also acknowledge his wisdom, and be kind of grateful to his contribution to Bangalore, Mysore, and other parts of India.
So we started to assemble and people who knew parts of his life and his biography, and we decided to come together and celebrate somehow his 150th birthday.
And I start at West Gate, Lalbagh. And I just always stand there just for a moment, and I just think great-grandfather must have walked, up. And I always like to walk in Lalbagh alone, and I just sort of walk up to I always walk past the super in bungalow, and I walk up to the glass house and I'm looking at the trees, and I sort of almost go into my own world, because I think Lalbagh has a very, very special, it's sort of almost mine. It is, because I just love it there and I can feel him there.
MINDIA, Mind of India.